Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Cadena. This is a video for Senior Capstone in Crime Science, and I want to talk a little bit about DNA evidence and how highly effective it is when we're seeking convictions in sexual abuse cases. Okay, so let's get started. So let me begin this presentation with the core, DNA. So what is DNA? DNA is in our body. It structures who we are, what we're made of. Every time we go somewhere, we leave DNA behind. We're made out of very detailed cells, which, if found anywhere, it can be pointed back directly to us. So it's very important to know that if we are in any situation or any place in this world, we are leaving a little bit of DNA behind. Family members carry 50% of the same DNA, but then there's also that 50% that is different. There's DNA that's found in a crime scene. It could be pointed directly back to the suspect or a family member. So there might be something similar, which we know, okay, there's something different, which means it's someone familiar to this person, but it's not specifically this person. They can be found somewhere else, the specific DNA. Every single human carries it. It's what, like I said, it's what makes us individuals, different from everybody else. So it's very important to know what is DNA before we start this presentation. Okay, so now we know what DNA is and what it stands for. But where do we find it? Where is this DNA that we talk about? Where it's everywhere. Everywhere we go, we leave a little bit of us behind. If we go to a friend's house and we sit down and we grab a glass and take some water or liquid from that cup, we put our lips, we're going to leave some DNA behind. It can be traced back to us. So we leave our presence in that scene. So let's say you're at a friend's house, something happens that night, you leave, then they're going to gather information on who was at that site. Now, if they do grab that cup that you drink from, they're going to point back to you that you were there. You're going to be a witness. You're going to be a suspect. You're going to be something related to that scene. So it's very important to understand why law enforcement is extremely important when it comes to a scene, a crime scene. DNA would be the only evidence that could be very specific on who was there if it gets traced. So once law enforcement secures the area or secures the scene, they can gather information, gather evidence. Once they collect that evidence and it's taken back to the crime scene techs and they test that DNA, then they can know, okay, this person was there, this person was not there, or if maybe they were there but they didn't leave anything behind. If that's the case, then it could be because they weren't there for a long period of time. They didn't drink anything, they didn't touch anything, they didn't have any shoes on, because this might get us a little bit sidetracked, but even our shoes leave DNA behind, their own DNA, which is the footprint. But that's another story. So let's take us back to DNA. DNA is extremely important, like I said, on every crime scene. It's what techs and science can actually take back to a lab and point out who this suspect could be. Not only that, but they can also say who was not there. So let's say there's an individual that says, yes, I did commit this rape, yes, I did commit this sexual abuse, but their DNA is not found. It's not found in the crime scene. Okay, so now we know what DNA is and where it can be found. Now let's talk a little bit about sexual abuse. We talked about this briefly about it on our previous slide. Sexual abuse basically goes back to no is no. If the victim said no, it means no. once the other person or the suspect at this point will abuse to commit sexual intercourse, then now we're talking about sexual abuse. Okay, it's very important to understand that sexual abuse can be defined either very specifically, or people might question it and say, well, maybe it wasn't abuse, and that's when the victim will not report it because they might think that they won't be believed. I'll dig a little bit more into that in my further slides, but just a brief touch on what is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse can be, it's gender neutral, there's no specific female, male. It's any sexual intercourse that takes place where the other person does not want to comply, if we say. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of where it came from. DNA and sexual abuse came together with a scientist called Dr. Alec Jeffreys. He started on a DNA testing in 1977, but he continued on working on it, and it wasn't until 1986 that he was called by law enforcement to actually work on a specific case of two 15-year-olds that were actually raped and murdered. In this case, Dr. Alec Jeffreys took the DNA that was collected from the bodies of the 15-year-old girls to test it with a suspect that they had. Now, the suspect that they were filing charges to was actually not guilty. He did have mental, let's say, difficulties, and he said that he did it. Well, when they took the DNA and they tested it, Dr. Alec Jeffreys found that he was not guilty. He had not committed either of the crimes, and they actually had another suspect. The other suspect was actually found later on when he tried collecting or went to a friend to request a blood sample to be tested on his behalf. So when that happened, the friend actually told on him, and that's when he was found that the DNA did match on those rape cases. So that's when the DNA started to get more effective, and it started being, so a year later after that case, it's when it started being used worldwide in different cases, and a lot of cases were solved from even previous years. So now let's move forward a little bit about what's the negative side of it. A lot of people are not informed. There's a lot of missing information on those people that get, unfortunately, raped. There's 80% of rape cases that go unreported, and there's a lot of reasons why. There's fear of the unknown, distortion, not being believed that it happened, feeling humiliated that it happened to them because they're too strong, they're too smart, they're too much for, they would never imagine that it could happen to them. Or maybe they're unfortunately too young and they blame themselves. I shouldn't have been there. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have talked to them. I shouldn't have dressed this way. So when those rape cases don't go reported, it's usually because they don't know who they can talk to, what they can do, how to proceed from that. They don't know, they never expected it could happen to them. So it's very common. It's more common than we expect. We think everybody knows on how to act if it happens to them. Unfortunately, that is not the case. There's a lot of fear of it being reported. So I think there's a lot of information that's missing, that we need to connect those cases with the fact that there is information. There are people that are willing to help, and DNA is extremely sensitive. And that's why when they were informed, the time frame from when they reported and DNA is collected is extremely sensitive. And that's why I wanted to point out on why missing information will not lead to timing when DNA needs to be collected. So I'll touch a little bit back and move a little bit further on what we talked about before. Result of the fear. So the fear from that missing information comes from within, right? It happens, sexual abuse happened. Some of the victims instantly want to take a shower. They want to remove any sense from that other person and eliminate that moment from their head. When that happens, DNA is washed out. DNA gets compromised. Because it gets washed out, the time frame from when it happened to when it's reported, if at any point is reported, DNA can possibly no longer be there. Then it's even harder for DNA sexual abuse to be reported, and not only reported, but in a criminal court to actually persecute the suspect and actually send them to jail and be convicted is extremely hard. It's not going to be as easy, or not as easy as liable as to present in court something that it might no longer be there. When there is DNA, there's more heaviness on the evidence in criminal court. That's why it's very important for that missing information to be out there to inform people that once it happens, DNA needs to be collected. Then that information can be taken in a court of law and be actually persecuted to that suspect. What happens then, if it gets washed out, if it gets compromised, if it doesn't get reported, the abuser will continue. And that's the scariest part. They think they can get away with it. And that's why we see a lot of repetitive abusers. It doesn't happen once, it happens multiple times, and actually to multiple individuals by that same abuser. So based on all of this that we had we talked about, what really needs to happen is information needs to be spread. Not only on what is happening, that there's people being raped and not being reported, but in order for victims to know how to react or know what to do in case it happens to them. And unfortunately, the word is always, it will never happen to me. But when it happens, or if it happens, or if we know somebody that's going through it, we want to provide this information. We want to spread the word. We need law enforcement, hospitals, psychologists to help out in giving information on what to do if it happens, and understand how sensitive DNA collection and testing is in a sexual abuse case. Once DNA is washed out of a victim, or time happens, then that suspect has less probabilities of getting caught. And if they do get caught and they're taken to a court of law, the evidence is not going to be as heavy as DNA in a victim of sexual abuse. Once a sexual assault evidence collection kit goes through in a hospital and psychologists are involved, there's history, there's actual evidence, scientific evidence of that abuse, of that DNA being present inside that victim's body. That's why it's extremely important. And DNA, once it's collected, it goes, even if the person or the suspect is not caught right away, it goes into an evidence database called CODIS. And even if that suspect is not caught with this specific case, they will commit another crime. That DNA then is collected again, and then it traces back to the sexual abuse or sexual assault that took place that day that it was reported. So there is more probabilities of a suspect of getting caught if there's DNA that's collected than if nothing is. And that is my presentation. It is extremely important to notate that this isn't only proving that DNA is important, but there are issues of DNA collection, which is the crime not being collected,